Welcome back. This is Module 7, Part 2 and 3 combined. And again, this is qualitative adaptations and comprehension. And we're going to be talking about guided practice, eliciting responses, and providing feedback. So the objectives for this Part 2 and 3 is that you will learn how to provide effective practice opportunities, elicit frequent responses, and provide effective feedback during comprehension instruction. Also, you'll learn how to adapt comprehension instruction to improve these practices. So when we're thinking about our model of explicit instruction, the first part of this is we're going to be focusing on the practice component. And particularly, we're going to be focusing on providing guided practice during comprehension instruction. So when we're talking about practice, why are we learning this? One of the things that we've been talking about in this module is how successful comprehension really requires active and strategic application of complex strategies. So unlike word reading, that there are these very specific skills that can become almost automatized, comprehension really requires this very active thinking and processing through strategies that have multiple steps. So there's a key role for practice when we're talking about comprehension, and that is that effective instruction really needs to guide students through practicing the steps of these comprehension strategies, giving them the opportunity to think aloud, just like we think aloud when we're modeling, and also giving them this opportunity to really grapple with and interact with real text. So practice becomes even that much more important when we're talking about teaching comprehension. So the steps and the components of effective guiding practice are the same that we've been working with. So this is focusing on the same singular objective and also using similar examples that we use as during the modeling process. We also want to guide students carefully through the steps of the skill or the strategy. We want to provide just right amount of guidance. So based on where students are, we want to provide the kind of guidance in practice that's going to be just right for them as they're building towards independence. We also want to provide very clear prompts and supports. All right, so starting on focusing on the same singular objective that we focused on during the modeling and using similar examples. I think this is pretty clear that we want to make sure that we're giving students practice on the same strategy that we've just introduced and just taught during the modeling practice. One of the things I think, though, that comes into play quite a bit in comprehension is really thinking about that we're giving kids practice on the same kinds of examples that we used for modeling. So here's an example. One of the strategies that we talked a little bit about is question-answer relationship, or QAR strategy. And this is a strategy that we teach that helps students understand how to answer different types of questions about text. There could be right there questions, think and search, author and you, and on my own. And each one of these questions requires a different strategy. So we've been talking a little bit about that. Maybe right there questions are questions where the answer is easy to find in the reading. The words used to make up the question are right there in the same sentence. So we may have gone through and modeled this. Here's an example of shifting into the practice component. I just showed you how to answer right there questions in this paragraph. Now let's see if you can answer them in our science article. So think a little bit about that. Is this the same singular objective? It is. We're talking about right there questions. But the thing that makes this different and potentially problematic is the example that we've used. We've modeled an example of how to answer right there questions in a paragraph that's probably developed so that the keywords are there and it makes a lot of sense, and it's a good example for modeling answering right there questions. But then instead of practicing on the same kind of paragraph, we're going to move right into the kind of text that we're using as part of science. So giving them practice on the same strategy, but not in the same kind of text. So this is going to be potentially harder for students to practice right away with this different kind of text that may be more difficult to answer right there questions. So we're going to give this as an X as a sort of non-example of using similar examples when we're practicing. Here's an example that might be a little bit better. I just showed you how to answer right there questions in this paragraph. Now let's see if you can answer them in this next paragraph. So this kind of conveys this idea that we've that we've chosen these paragraphs very carefully to be good examples for how to use the QRA relationships to answer right there questions. So we're not sort of shifting to this authentic text or text in other areas right away. We're giving additional practice on paragraphs that in some sense are kind of constrained to be able to provide good examples for answering these questions. So we want to focus on the same singular objective, but we also want to very carefully select the examples that we're both modeling and using for guided practice. Okay, the next component is to guide students through the skill and strategy. So we talked about this during the modeling piece, that we might be teaching a strategy for figuring out the main idea. And we talked about how we want to use clear and concise and consistent language. So we have these clear steps. First, we name the person in the paragraph. Second, we will tell the main thing that the person did in all the sentences. Then during the modeling phase, we also are going to demonstrate the strategy by talking aloud and showing the thinking. So we go through the 2 steps during the modeling process. It's my turn to come up with the main idea sentence. First, I'll name the person, and here's how I'll do that. Then I'll figure out the main thing that the person did in all the sentences. And so I go very carefully through all the steps, thinking aloud, showing my thinking about how I'm going to find the main idea sentence. So sometimes then what we do is we move into guided practice and we say, okay, now it's your turn to come up with the main idea sentence for this paragraph. All right, who can tell me the main idea? So what's problematic here? The idea is that we went so carefully through the modeling process, step by step, and showing our thinking. But then as soon as we got to the practice opportunity, we're sort of let kids on their own to come up with the main idea on their own. When instead, what we should do is really guide through the skill and the strategy in the same way we did during the modeling process, right? So it may look more like this. Okay, now it's your turn to come up with the main idea sentence for this paragraph. So what's the first step in telling the main idea? The student may say, first, I name the person in the sentences. Yes, that's right. Who is the person? The student might say, the person is Benjamin Banneker. Great job naming the person. What's the second step in telling the main idea? The next step is to tell what the person did in all the sentences. Let's see. All the sentences seem to be about clocks or making clocks. I think the main idea sentence would be Benjamin Banneker built clocks. Yes, you found the main idea. So you can see the difference here is we've shifted into guided practice, but we're still guiding students through the strategy step by step, giving them the opportunity to kind of talk through what are the steps of the strategy, think aloud as they complete each of those steps until they come up with the main idea. We also want to provide students with just right amount of guidance and based on students' skills. And this is the part that when we talked about before, it's really difficult. And this is kind of judging the level of practice and the kinds of supports we're providing during practice to really be based on where students are, what their current skill levels are. And the whole point of this really is to be sort of scaffolding this practice so that we're moving them gradually towards being independently able to implement the skills and strategies. And again, this is really, really important in comprehension. So some of the things that we want to think about is we're teaching these strategies for comprehension. And what we want to do is we want to kind of start by giving them practice, really going step by step through the strategy with a lot of feedback and a lot of guidance as they're moving through. But over time, we know that to be successful comprehenders, that students need to be able to apply these strategies flexibly. And so we want to gradually sort of take away the supports during practice over time so that they're going to be able to do this in a way where they can use these strategies flexibly. And that's going to be quite a long process over what guided practice looks like over days and weeks and months. The other thing that we think about in terms of just right amount of practice is what kind of texts we're using to practice these. And kind of like we talked about a few minutes ago, we want to kind of work from really constrained text that we've selected or even developed to be a really good example for how this strategy might work, to really encouraging students to be able to use these strategies in authentic kinds of text that they're using and reading in other areas, reading in content areas, reading on their own, zone because we want them to be able to use these strategies in a lot of different situations. But at the beginning, we want to constrain those texts so that we're sort of maximizing the chance that students will be successful. But over time, we want to take away some of those supports and give them practice being able to apply these strategies to authentic text. So this process of providing just the right amount of guidance for comprehension instruction is really critical and something that we need to think about, not necessarily within a lesson, but across lessons and across time. Finally, we want to provide clear prompts and supports. And prompts and supports are going to look a little bit different in comprehension than they did in word reading when we were doing some things like pointing and snapping and giving these kind of prompts to cue students to read words. But again, we want to use consistent language and prompts and supports to help students work through these comprehension strategies too. So one of the things is a clear prompt might be to display the steps of a strategy. Name the person the sentences are about, tell what the person did in all the sentences. So this is a support that students can use to remind them that these are the steps of the strategy. Another thing that we can do is sort of use similar wording and a similar prompt when we're prompting kids to remember the steps and to say the steps. So kind of consistently saying, okay, what's the first step in telling the main idea? What's the next step in telling the main idea? So that they get used to that we're going to kind of review and go through the steps of these strategies, and you're going to expect me to prompt you to talk about what are the different steps. For something like the QAR strategy, another way that we might be providing kind of consistent, clear prompts and supports are things like underline the question words in the paragraph. So one of the things about right there questions is usually the words that are in the question are also going to be there right in the sentence in the text. So consistently sort of prompting students to underline question words in the paragraph might be a way that where you can provide this sort of kind of clear support and clear prompt when we're providing practice in comprehension strategies. Another thing that we can do is use graphic organizers and story maps and examples of text structures. All those things are very helpful supports when we're applying and practicing comprehension strategies. So today we are going to use our story map. And again, using these kind of material scaffolds as prompts for comprehension. Okay, so that was the components of effective practice, and I showed you some examples and non-examples of how those might look and play out when we're talking about comprehension instruction. Now we're going to move to talk a little bit about the supporting practices for comprehension instruction, and specifically focusing on eliciting frequent responses and providing immediate and specific feedback. So why are we doing this? Just to remind you, we talked about before that student learning, to maximize student learning, we want to elicit frequent responses because we know that every time that students get an opportunity to respond, to do something, to be actively engaged in instruction, that's going to increase the possibility that they're going to learn the material. And it also keeps kids' heads in the game. The more they're doing something, the more they're engaged, the more they're focused, and they're attending to the lesson. We also know that by providing immediate specific feedback, we're ensuring that learning is happening. We're right there with students so that we can correct any misunderstandings right away, and we keep learning on track so that it doesn't sort of veer off and develop a misrule or for students to kind of misinterpret what's happening. So those are the reasons why we really need to focus on things like eliciting feedback or eliciting responses and providing feedback. So when we're talking about eliciting frequent responses, the components that we want to think about are making sure that we think carefully about selecting the most appropriate response format and what kind of responses, how many students are engaged in the responses, and sort of how much time do these responses take. We also want to make sure that we're maximizing engagement and the opportunities to practice. So one of the things that we can do is think back to our opportunities to learn and practice, the response format kind of criteria or categories that we talked about. So we could talk about what kind of responses are we asking students for. Are they verbal responses? Are they written responses? Are there some sort of gestures we're asking for? We could also think about how many students are involved in the response. Is this an individual response? Are we asking kids to respond together in pairs? Or are we asking for a whole group response? And then we can also think about sort of how much time. Is this like a really short response that we can move ahead quickly? Or is this something that's going to take students a little bit longer to process and to think about? So when we're thinking about this in terms of comprehension, we can come back to our main idea strategy. And we can think about the way this was written. So before we saw this, the teacher says, so what's the first step in telling the main idea? And the teacher might look around and say, can you raise your hand if you can tell us the first step? And the teacher might look around and then calls on a student. And the student might say, first I name the person in the sentence. The teacher could follow up and say, yes, who is the person? The student says the person is Benjamin Banneker. So when we think about our chart here, what kind of response format is this? First, it's verbal. We're asking the student to respond. It's also individual, and we're doing this in a way where we're looking for volunteers, and we're kind of calling on someone who's volunteered. And how long does this take? It's fairly short, but it probably takes a little bit longer because we're waiting for students to raise their hands, and we're kind of scanning and calling on a student. So not super short, but pretty quick. We can also think about how we might do this taking advantage of some different response formats that actually might increase opportunities to respond for the group of students. So instead of asking an individual student, we might say, everyone, what's the first step in telling the main idea? And then the group could respond, name the person in the sentences. And so this would be still a verbal response, but this would be a group response instead of an individual response. And this would be pretty quick. And this might be a place where we actually would do some sort of a prompt or a signal to encourage all the students to respond together. Another example might be then, put your thumbs up if you think you know the person in the sentences. Right, so we're moving on to the next kind of working through this step of the strategy. So this kind of response is a gesture, right? So we're asking students to put their thumbs up if they think they know who the person is. Again, this is a group response because everybody is responding. And this is a really short, quick, show me if you're with me or not. Again, another way to keep everyone engaged and involved in the learning. Then we might say, okay, talk with your partner about the person and write the name on your main idea sheet. So this response is both verbal and written because we're having students talk with each other in pairs. And then it's written because they're supposed to write it down in their main idea sheet. Also notice this idea about a main idea sheet. This could be some kind of a prompt or a scaffold or a support that's built in that helps them kind of make sure they're staying with the steps of the strategy. This is a pair. And this might take a little bit longer, but again, this is giving students a chance to interact with the text and talk with each other. And so this might be a place where you've decided that it's okay to take a little bit longer because this is a part where students are really processing the steps of the strategy. Okay, so the idea here is that we want to get beyond just the I'm going to call on an individual student and think about how we can change up different kinds of response formats to get everyone involved and also changing modalities to thinking about how we could do verbal and written and gestures to keep everyone's head in the game and to really make sure everybody is engaged and actively participating in doing the steps of strategies when we're working on comprehension. Okay, when we're talking about providing immediate and specific feedback, the components that we want to think about first are that we want to provide feedback immediately. We don't want to wait. We want to provide it as quickly as possible. We also want to affirm correct responses, and we want to correct incorrect responses, and also provide additional practice when a student misses something. So if you're thinking about affirming correct responses, again, this is pretty simple. We don't want to just always say good job or way to try hard. We want to try to be as specific as we can around what it was that the student did correctly. So in this one, we say great job naming the person. Again, this always sounds a little kind of artificial and forced, but it's really a kind of way to provide a little bit of a reteaching opportunity. So when we're confirming what the student did, the student knows not just that they were correct, but what it was they did. And also, we're saying it out loud again. So it's another reinforcement of what it is that we're doing and what the step is of the strategy. So then we also want to talk about providing feedback that's immediate, and then how do we correct incorrect responses. So I want to go back to a non-example that we used a little bit earlier. So this is when we are moving into the practice phase, and instead of going through the steps of the strategy step by step to provide practice, we just sort of said, okay, now it's your turn to come up with the main idea sentence for this paragraph. Who can tell me the main idea? So what might happen is a student might say, I know, Benjamin Banneker took apart a pocket watch. So the first thing we know here is that this is incorrect. This isn't the main idea. Remember, the main idea is we want to say what the person did in all the sentences. And this is a very specific detail that comes up in just one of the sentences. Now the tricky part here is we don't know where the student made a mistake. We don't know whether or not he knew the steps of the strategy or she knew the steps of the strategy but was just applying it incorrectly, or whether the student misunderstood or misremembered the steps of the strategy. So we're not able to really provide immediate feedback here because we don't know where the error occurred. And again, that's one of the reasons why we want to walk students through the strategy during guided practice, because then we can correct errors immediately when they happen. This is sort of internalized error at some point. So we can certainly correct this error in this situation, but we can't be as specific or as immediate as we could be when we were working through the strategy step by step. So here's another example that allows us to do that. So we might say, okay, what is the second step in telling the main idea? And the student says, the next step is to tell what the person did in the first sentence. So now we see where the error was. It isn't in applying the strategy, is this student is mixed up in what the step of the strategy is. So now we can provide an error correction. Remember, what we do is we don't say, oh, that's wrong, or wait a minute, or think harder. We just say the correct response. So we could say, the next step is to tell what the person did in all the sentences, and then give another opportunity. So what's the second step? And then the student could say, oh yeah, the next step is to tell what the person did in all the sentences. Let's see. All the sentences seem to be about clocks or making clocks. I think the main idea sentence would be Benjamin Banneker built clocks. Yes, you found the main idea. So a couple of things to think about here is, one, we were able to correct the error right away, and we had information about what the error was. And the way we corrected it is sort of the common strategy that we've been using all the time, which is we're just going to provide the correct answer, and then we're going to give the student another opportunity to answer the question again. So we were able to do that during this process here. Also here you can see that there's an example of affirming correct responsive with specifics. We say, yes, you found the main idea. So we'll give that a check for correct. Okay, so we are now going to move on to an activity where you're going to evaluate a video. We saw a part of this video in the earlier part one, and we focused on modeling. But in this case, you're going to be focusing on thinking about the components of guided practice and the components of eliciting responses and providing feedback. And so we'll be just seeing that component. So I want you to watch the video and go through the checklist and see if you can evaluate this video based on the components of practice and feedback that we talked about.
So we're going to practice today using a photo. So I want us to look at step number one. Step number one is to identify the most important who or what in this photo. Come on your knee if you think you found the most important who or what in this photo. Owen?
The girl in the white dress.
Why do you think the girl in the white dress is the most important who or what?
Because she's the only one that's wearing the white dress.
Step number two is to identify the most important information about the who or what. I'm going to give you some think time. So we said the most important who or what is the girl in the white dress. Thumb on your knee if you'd like to share the most important information about the who or what. Aiden?
The most important thing about the who and what is the girl in the white dress getting married.
Who thinks they can help us? Right now we're going to say this information in one short sentence using 10 words or less. That's step number 3. Rachel?
The girl in the white dress is getting married.
Girl in the white dress is getting married. Go ahead and put a thumb on your head if you agree. All right. Now we're going to practice with a different photo, and you're going to talk to your partner about it. I'm going to give you some think time before you turn and talk to your partner. So here's our next photo. Step number 1 is to identify the most important who or what. So I just want you to think. Do you know who the most important who or what is in this photo? Just thinking, that means hands are down, mouths are closed. Step number 2 is to identify the most important information about the who or what. Step number 3 is to write or say the information in one short sentence, 10 words or less. Go ahead and turn and talk to your partner about this photo. What's number 2? What's step number 2? Step number 1? Okay, who or what is the most important in this photo?
That Miss Angela is graduated from high school.
Looks like you already did step number 3. You put all of your information into one sentence. I heard the who or what. That was Miss Andrews, me. And your important information about me is that I'm graduating. And then you put it into one sentence. You can help us share what they and their partner were talking about. Number 1, identify the most important who or what. You can help us what who is the most important or what is the most important. Aiden?
The most important who or what is you graduating with your graduation hat.
Okay, so the most important who you think is me, and you think that because I'm wearing a special hat? Who can help us with number 2, identify the most important information about the who or what? Addison?
Oh, the most important information about who or what is that you're graduating.
Can someone help us to say this information in one short sentence, 10 words or less? Eva?
Miss Andrews is graduating.
Can you say it nice and loud for everyone to hear?
Miss Andrews is graduating.
Go ahead and clap once if you agree with Eva. All right, friends. So as we continue to learn about main idea, you can start to use it when you're reading a story, okay? Good job helping us find the main idea of these pictures.
Okay, so we were looking at this video to look at these components and features of guided practice, as well as eliciting responses and providing feedback. So when we talk about guided practice, we know that she's focusing on the same objective that she described before, and she's guiding students through the skill and strategy. So she asks and goes through the steps of the strategy at least one time. And she's also providing pretty clear prompts and supports. We can also talk a little bit about the kinds of responses that she elicits. She does a few different pretty neat things about how she gets kids to respond. So one of the things that she does is she says, put your thumb on your knee if you can identify the most important who or what. So that's a kind of a gesture, and she's able to also kind of scan the classroom to see if people are understanding. And then she calls on a student, an individual student, and this student is she calls on Owen unpredictably, so she doesn't kind of go in a predictable order, so that means all the students have to be prepared to respond. Another thing that she does is she follows up. She says, why do you think she is the most important who or what? And this is a really important point here, because what she's doing is she's eliciting this thinking aloud process. And we talked about when we're guiding students through the strategy, we want to provide them a chance to really think aloud and talk through how they came up with the answer. So by doing this sort of follow-up, she's really getting the students to think aloud and kind of talk through how they came up with the answer. She also does some things where she provides students think time, which is helpful. She also then says, work and talk with your partner. So she gives them a chance to work together in pairs. And then when they finally check back in, they go through the process again. So they don't just sort of say, tell us the main idea sentence. She goes, all right, who's the most important who or what? And she goes through it again. So there's some really good examples in here about kind of walking and guiding students through the strategy, through doing some different types of response formats. If you did have some thoughts about some ways to improve it, some ways that you might think about, is one that she could maybe provide guided practice a few more times before letting the students work in pairs. So she could walk through a few more examples where there's really highly guided practice. There could be some opportunities where they do a little bit more whole group responses. So all of the good things that she did, she could have done a little bit more of those or continued to do them a few more times if this group needed extra support. It looked like to me that this group was on track pretty much, so maybe she didn't need to do that, and maybe this was the just right amount of guidance for these students. Okay, we are now going to shift to the next slide and work on evaluating a lesson. So in this, you're going to look at this example of a lesson for teaching summarizing, a strategy of summarizing, and you're going to evaluate this lesson based on our criteria. And for this one, you're actually going to go through and look at the criteria through all the different areas. So the modeling, practice, and additional practices. When you're going to stop the video and you're going to read through this and really think about whether or not this lesson meets these features that we've been talking about. Then we'll come back and talk a little bit about it, and then after that you're going to stop the video again and you're going to think about how you could adapt or revise this lesson to make it more supportive for students experiencing reading difficulties. All right, here's our lesson on summarizing, and let's talk through a little bit some of the things that you may have observed when you were reading this. Off the bat, you probably noticed that there was not a lot here, so there's definitely room for improvement and for revision. So if we're talking about the modeling process, we want to focus on a singular objective, and in this case, we're talking about summarizing. So we'll say that this is focusing on a singular objective. Although, of course, we could always kind of step back and have an objective be a component of a strategy instead of a whole strategy. So if you were thinking about that, that's a perfectly appropriate thing to be thinking about. Next, we want to explain the steps or explain what we're going to be doing with clear, concise, and consistent language. And in this case, there is some pretty clear language that talks about what summarizing is. It says that summarizing is choosing the most important ideas of a story and telling them in a few sentences. And this isn't listed out in a particular steps, but I think that we could at least give this lesson credit with explaining what summarizing is in fairly clear language. If this was something that you said wasn't clear, that's fine too. There's many ways that we could rewrite this maybe to make it more clear. But just because this lesson has very little to recommend it, we'll give them credit for this. But the next piece when we talk about modeling or demonstrating the skill or strategy, we don't see any of that here. And probably that's one of the main problems with this lesson. It explains what summarizing is, but it doesn't then have the teacher go ahead and kind of go through this process to show students what it looked like, to think out loud. It doesn't model multiple examples, and we don't really know, there isn't really any examples that they've talked about that they're going to model. So when we move on to effective guided practice, here's the place where it really has very little guidance on how to teach this lesson. right? So practice basically just says, have students reread the first section of today's selection and have them summarize the section. So it's just moving on, you're good to go ahead and practice summarizing. And then it says, invite students to share their summarization. So there really isn't any of that kind of components of the effective guided practice here. And we don't really know much about how the teacher is supposed to be eliciting responses or providing feedback. The response format of just invite students to share the summarization with the class is probably not going to be a way that's going to maximize engagement. Okay, so we know we have some problems here. So the next step is to stop the tape again and jot down some ideas for how you might adapt this lesson to make it more supportive and to more effectively meet the components that we talk about when we're thinking about providing explicit instruction within comprehension strategy. Okay, hopefully you were able to think a little bit about how you might adapt this lesson to make it more supportive. And I'm going to show you an example of a revised lesson that tries to address some of the things that we talked about. Right off the bat, I'll say that because of the constraints of this format, wasn't really able to develop a fully developed lesson. So this lesson that I'm going to show you is going to fix some things, but it still probably has lots of room for improvement. And so that hopefully you'll be able to see that there are some things about here that you could even continue to expand and to build on to make this even more intensive and supportive. So the first thing is that we revised the introduction a little bit. And it says, think about how you would tell someone the story of our recent field trip. Would you tell every single thing or just the most important parts? So in the original version, this was an activity where kids were supposed to talk about a field trip. And you might think that that was something that maybe would take time away from teaching the lesson. And that it's basically asking kids to summarize before they were taught to summarize. In this case, we sort of left it in a little bit because maybe it's a good idea to kind of make a connection to something that students would know as a kind of a really brief introduction to the strategy. Then we left in the wording, point out that choosing the most important ideas of a story and telling them in a few sentences is called summarizing. So then one of the main things that we added here is a modeling or a think aloud component. So it says, read aloud the first two paragraphs of the selection, and then model your thinking about summarizing the important ideas. One of the pieces here is that we're having the teacher read aloud, in a sense to kind of make sure that the example is accessible to everyone. One of the things that we could think about with comprehension is that we don't have to have students reading to themselves or reading the text. We can do it through oral language so that they can focus more on comprehending and rather than having to decode, which sometimes can keep kids from accessing the content. And so then we have the teacher some suggested wording for how they might model or talk through or think aloud. And it says, although there are many details in this section, I try to narrow them down to just the most important ideas. Here are 3 important ideas. Each year, the puffins return to Iceland to lay their eggs and raise chicks. When the puffins get big enough to leave their nest, some become confused and land in the village, and children of the village then help them get to sea. Okay, so here, that was me sort of thinking aloud and leading students through how I was thinking about it and pulling out important details. And then we have some guidance here that the lesson then would repeat the same modeling and think aloud procedure with the next 2 paragraphs. So that means that there's going to be multiple modeled examples, and ideally that this is a text where this is going to be something that works, where you're able to kind of summarize it fairly easily because we're just learning this strategy. Okay, then we move on to providing guided practice. It says then the teacher reads aloud the next 2 paragraphs of the selection, and the teacher could say something like, now you are going to practice summarizing the important ideas. Everyone, what do you do when you summarize? And this would be a place where a group response, the students could say, you tell just the important ideas. And this may be something that you would need to practice, but again, you want students to be able to articulate and think aloud, here's what you do when you do this strategy. The teacher, yes, that's right. You just tell the important ideas. So I'm giving specific feedback and affirming the correct response. And then the teacher could say, everyone, write down one important idea. So this is a written response, and it's a group response because everyone is doing it. And then it says, Maria, what is one important idea from these paragraphs? So it's a place where the teacher might randomly call on the student to share one of the important ideas. The student could then identify an important idea, and then teacher could again affirm the correct response. Great job telling an important idea. Now everyone write down another important idea. So what it's trying to do here is at least guiding students through the skill and strategy, really thinking about trying to maximize opportunities to practice by building in some group responses that include some written responses and then some check-ins on individual verbal responses, and kind of providing that kind of feedback. And if students made a mistake, that we would have corrective feedback. And actually that the next component here says the teacher completes this practice example and gives students guided practice with 2 more examples. Teacher corrects any errors immediately by modeling the correct response and giving students a second opportunity to respond correctly. So then this is trying to explicitly talk about eliciting responses and providing feedback. So hopefully in your thinking about this, you were thinking some of the same ways about trying to build in more modeling, build in more guided practice, specifically guiding students through, modeling multiple examples, giving multiple examples for practice, thinking about how you can maximize engagement and opportunities to respond, and thinking about a kind of specific procedure for providing feedback, both for correct responses. Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Before completing this module, be sure to complete the journal entry on Husky CT. There are resources and more directions in your activity workbook.